So, in an interview with Wired magazine a few years back, our first speaker revealed that he narrowly avoided entering one cult of Catholicism, and soon after that became a leader in another cult under the tutelage of George Simon. Now, I have to say, it is refreshing in a jaded world such as ours to spend time with someone who truly believes that technology is a path to enlightenment and the betterment of humanity. So I'd like you to welcome the cult leader of O'Reilly Media and my boss, Tim O'Reilly.
Read that Wired profile to understand that reference, I think. Thanks a lot for coming. You know, it's funny because this is the 10th anniversary of OSCon, but it is actually the, let's see if I can get this to work. No, it's not working now. It's actually the 12th anniversary of the Pearl Conference, which is where it all started, at least for me. And what happened back in 1997, when I first started my activism about open source, was that I realized people weren't really paying attention. And I think my biggest contribution, apart from recognizing the power of Perl on the web, was where I started. It was sort of like I literally began my activism with Perl, asking a bunch of people, what are you doing that's making this language so powerful and so important? And it turned out many of those applications were on the web. So from the very beginning, my interest in open source was a little different than many of the other people who came to it from Linux, because I was thinking about the internet and the online world in the beginning. And it was kind of interesting when we had that meeting. The second meeting that Allison referred to was called the Freeware Summit, because the term open source hadn't been adopted. Despite the earlier meeting, there really wasn't agreement, because in the one I held, Michael Tiemann was still arguing for his term sourceware versus the term that Eric was championing, open source. And we actually took a vote. But the biggest contribution I think I made to the open source movement was to bring the internet and the Linux community together. Because actually many of the luminaries of open source on the internet had never met the luminaries of open source on Linux. And so, for example, when Forbes covered the event that we held, I was proudest of seeing Paul Vixie, the guy who'd been maintaining Bind for many, many years in obscurity, in the cover, not on the cover, Linus was on the cover, but in the pages of Forbes, big picture, because, oh my God, here was this incredibly influential piece of software that nobody was paying attention to. So, but anyway, we did bring things together. Okay, forget this. It just doesn't seem to have the range. It's funny. This is all I could find in terms of going back to the Wayback Machine of the pages from that first OSCon. It's actually a PR announcement. I just want to remind you, this relates to the history project. We're crappy at keeping our history now that it's digital. And there's so many things I've been a part of, and I've really regretted that I haven't done a better job of keeping a record. So I just want to urge all of you to keep your history, because you guys have been making history for the last 10 years. You're making history ongoing. Keep that history. Make it accessible. Carl Malama has this great subdomain of his sites. It's always called Museum. And it's really worth thinking about. So anyway, I found also this report from that first open source convention. And just to give you a sense of history, it had tracks for Apache, Linux, Python, Sentinel, TickleTK, right? And even an open source business track. It was quite controversial at the time. But these were the times of open source wars. This was the famous T-shirt from Atlanta Linux Showcase in 1999. The same year we had, Linux. This was the mood of the time. And then there was this famous T-shirt that I think Eric Raymond popularized. It was a Gandhi quote. This is actually a later generation of the shirt with the name Gandhi misspelled. The line is, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then you win. And I think that's a pretty apt description. Eric was prescient in saying that was going to be the arc. But of course, speaking of laughing at you, how many people were here as we were laughing at ourselves last night? I put up the American Idol because I was sitting there trying to figure out, if we had an American Idol for, top open source comedian, would it be Rommel Lefkowitz or Damian Conway? We have a show of hands here for Rommel. Okay, how about Damian? All right. You guys, if you weren't there last night, you really missed some serious fun. And it does, however, say something about our cult, that I don't think these guys would make it on American Idol because most of their jokes would be over the head of most of the American people. And or most of the people of the world, you hear laughs at incredibly arcane stuff. But speaking of matching up photos, Mark Shuttleworth last night was talking about how he wants to outdo Apple. I'm also wondering if he wants to sort of outdo Steve Jobs with his new user interface. It's starting to look like they were separated at birth, and I guess I wonder if that's actually going to be the arc for Ubuntu. But kind of back to "then we win," in that quote. Clearly, I remember back in 1998 trying to talk Gartner into covering open source, and they said, "Why would we cover that? Our customers aren't asking about it." Well, clearly, Gartner has been doing open source summits for years. Now they're on board. Microsoft is on board. So we definitely won the battle that we were doing back then. And I kind of want to give you a little highlight from this report we just published called Open Source in the Enterprise. And part of it involves some data on sort of jobs. Basically we spidered millions of jobs. Overall, IT jobs are a tiny fraction of all jobs posted, about 2.3%, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. At technology-oriented companies, tech jobs can be very, very high. I mean, for example, at Yahoo, it's actually close to 40% of all jobs are sort of open source tech jobs. We kind of did an analysis and we looked at how open source was faring in non-tech companies. Now, clearly, tiny fraction. 1 in 385 jobs, or about 1/4% of jobs basically in enterprise companies are open source jobs. So much smaller fraction than IT jobs as a whole. In tech companies, it's actually about 1.9%. But I guess the point is, it's actually growing. The graph, the line chart, shows that actually adoption is now growing much faster in non-tech companies. So we kind of conquered the tech companies, and now moving on to the. So again, when I say 1 in 55, 2%, remember that's against the base of 2.3%. So, and in terms of looking at what has the highest score, Linux, that's really actually roughly equal within the range of statistics to almost being in all jobs. Actually, Perl surprised me by being the second most commonly requested open source skill in job descriptions, JavaScript number 3, and it falls off pretty abruptly from there. You have to remember this is across a universe of all companies. But when you look at what's growing the fastest, it's kind of interesting. It's things like Django and Alfresco, Zimbra, Drupal, all shooting up. And I apologize, we didn't actually do a search for Joomla, which I believe probably would be way up there too. Also Memcached. Very cool to see what's actually kind of on the uptake, even though the scores are very small. And just for comparison with other, enterprise software coming from proprietary companies, Linux has, for example, deeper penetration than SQL Server. We didn't put Windows in there because Windows is also used for office jobs, not just IT jobs. Anyway, just kind of give you a sense that we have, in fact, come into real contention in the enterprise. So we should be patting ourselves on the back, right? I'm not so sure. There's this great quote from Kim Stanley Robinson, the science fiction writer. He says, "History is a wave that moves through time more quickly than we do." Right? And one of my contentions from the very beginning of my advocacy about open source, so much so that I feel like a broken record, I've been saying the same thing for 10 years, which is pay attention to the real consequences of the wave we unleash. If you're not familiar with my talking about this, go read my paper, The Open Source Paradigm Shift, What is Web 2.0? These are all about the consequences of open source. Look at the video of my talk from last year. I don't want to run the risk of sounding like a broken record, so I'm not going to go there again. But I am going to talk about 3 big challenges and opportunities, areas where the wave is moving very fast and we have to change to keep up. But also I want to talk about my optimism that open source is keeping up. Because in contrast to past years where I sometimes felt like I was, saying, hey, pay attention, and nobody was, in fact, last year even, I had the so-called, I had a meeting with Evan Moglen where we were going to talk about the challenges of licensing in the cloud, and all he wanted to do was bash me for talking about open source instead of free software, and it felt so retro. Back in 1999, I talked with Richard Stallman about the problems of Google. I said, Richard, if you had all of Google's source code, you still wouldn't have Google. And he said, it doesn't matter because their software isn't running on my computer. And we've clearly gotten over that. But we've only gotten over it recently. And we're now looking at cloud computing. And so, it's pretty cool that we have Amazon Web Services, and we have Google App Engine. We're starting to look at all this. There's some cool startups, particularly in the rail space, Engineer, Heroku, RightScale, which is actually trying to build a layer on top of AWS that will make it more portable. Really cool, a lot of open source. But the thing that I am most concerned about is a quote I got from a couple of years ago from Deborah Trafferty, who's Microsoft's VP of Operations at Windows Live. She said, in the future, being on someone's platform will mean being hosted on their infrastructure. Now, the ever-quotable Jesse Vincent, actually, I put these in wrong order. Of course, this means that we're subject to other people's status. Here's a recent image of Twirl with all the images gone of the people because AWS was down. But the ever-quotable Jesse Vincent described this problem as Web 2.0 is digital sharecropping. That should have been this year's Jesse Vincent t-shirt. He didn't get it together. I want to see if we can get him to make that. We have to really think about this. Danny O'Brien wrote, if we want people to have the same degree of user autonomy as we've come to expect, we may have to sit down and code alternatives to Google Docs, Twitter, and EC2 that can live with us on the edge, and not be run by third parties. Because one of the things about what's happening with Web 2.0 and cloud computing is immense centralization. Now, there's this countervailing trend, and a lot of my thinking was shaped by peer-to-peer software, and when I started thinking about this new system we're building, P2P is a big part of it. But we have to keep engaging with that. And we need to think about what will make this web platform of the future open. Because we can't take for granted that when we really do move fully to the internet as a platform, to cloud computing, that it's going to be the same way that it was in a world where software was distributed, ran on individual machines. And so we do have to keep our minds open. We have to keep thinking about how do we redefine and restructure the world so that it matches our values rather than the other way around. So, just a caveat, web does not mean HTTP in the way we talk about it today. When I first started talking about Web 2.0, I meant everything from Napster, which of course is not a web application, to distributed computation, web services, all kinds of things. Everything about the internet as platform. And today it even means phone. I like the old definition of the internet, the network of networks. But so it's kind of cool. We're starting to push the boundaries. So there's a session I just ran into Rabel and Kellen last night, just talking about what they're trying to do with XMPP. To try to figure out, can we build the next generation of web services, using the Java messaging protocol. And so people are doing some really good exploration, and this is why I'm so positive. And I love the Perl slogan, there's more than one way to do it, because we're seeing that today. The open source community and its vibrancy and its, the freedom is going at this problem in many, many different ways. And, so we got Hadoop, we've got Eucalyptus, the open source alternative to EC2. We've got a new startup from Gare Magnuson, Tengen, which is trying to build an open source stack for cloud computing. We've got Brian Akers Drizzle, trying to sort of rethink MySQL to make it, go back to its roots as a web driver. Jesse, has this great session, I think, on something he's doing peer-to-peer replication. This is, is, was the Windows Live Sync done right. Jesse has this great, slide from one of his previous Prophet talks. See, we do have a political agenda. Your data shouldn't be exportable from the cloud. You should always have full control. You guys are starting to think about this, and that's so exciting because you're going to solve this problem. Another, James Duncan sent me a note about a project they've got called reasonablysmart.com. James was one of the people with Simon Wardley working on Zimkey, which was unfortunately aborted by its corporate overlords. But again, an open source web platform. And even the FSF with the autonomous group has started to think seriously for the first time about these issues. So very exciting. Cloud computing is one part of what I've called Web 2.0. Another piece is the programmable web. And I want to distinguish these because it's really important. When you go look at a site like programmableweb.com and you look at the Web 2.0 API directory, these are functions that are data oriented. You look down, you see advertising, answers, blog search, blogging, bookmarks, calendar, catalog. And so, I've made the assertion for a long time that one of the big paradigm shift changes that was brought in play by the commoditization of software via open source was that data was becoming a new source of value and lock-in. I use the phrase, data is the intel inside. And I think we have to really think about that. I use the term the Internet operating system. People like Tim Bray, who I saw here, like to make fun of me because they say it's not an operating system. And I say, well, it isn't yet. By the same terms, LA isn't a city. There's the famous, line, LA is 72 suburbs in search of a city. But right now, the web is 72 subsystems in search of an operating system. I think it will come. But the subsystems, many of them will be data subsystems, location, identity, time, products, media types. And somebody's going to own these things. And we have to think about what will keep them free. The other aspect, and this is something that's really important, is, extracting data and value from extracting meaning from this data requires what I've called programming collective intelligence. So this is one of our best-selling books of the last year. Fortunately, a lot of the algorithms are available with open source libraries, but pay more attention to this stuff. But back to the idea of lock-in. You think about when you stick a CD into, say, iTunes or any other music player, you're looking up data from a proprietary service. Somebody owns the mapping. And yes, there have been attempts to free it with MusicBrainz and FreeDB. But at the end of the day, people say, oh yeah, it's okay, we'll pay the CDDB tax. Amazon is doing this play right now with Kindle, with a proprietary file format that only they will own, you will have to publish to this device through Amazon. On the other hand, because of competition, other people are pushing in the other direction. Yahoo with their Boss service, for example, opening up their search index, really heartening sign. And I also really like some of the things happening in open source. We talked about Doppler earlier. There's a service called AMI, which is providing carbon calculations to Doppler. And this is a kind of new, open, headless web service. AMI doesn't have an application. They're just providing a data service to other applications. They're working on open protocols for sharing sensor data about carbon. And I think this is a really, really, first of all, open source engaging with a really important, big problem. Global warming, climate change, peak oil, all these things are starting to cast new energy and ideas into our ecosystem. It's not just about the consumer and consumer electronics and consumer applications. It's about serious applications, and they need the open web platform. David Ricordan is talking about this tomorrow in a talk, a keynote tomorrow morning called Supporting the Open Web. The third big challenge that I think we really have to get our heads around is open mobile. Recent quote, the browser wars are back. So they're back on the phone. And you look at what's happening with the iTunes Music Store and the success of the new iPhone, for example. And this is a proprietary playground that's drawing a lot of developer attention. And even open source projects, open source companies like WordPress are building their downloadable linear blobs for the iPhone. But there's also something amazing happening, and I just want to bring your attention to it. Big companies like Google are putting a stake in the ground saying, we believe in open, we have to believe in open. I did an op-ed for the New York Times, actually it was about net neutrality, but I had a line in there that was cut by the Times editors, and it was, I said, the net neutrality and Google's Open Handset Alliance are among the company's most strategic initiatives. Google understands that if the mobile phone is not open, they're toast. All right? And this is kind of like Microsoft back in '95 embracing open source rather than embracing open source today. Right? So it's wonderful that leading company of Web 2.0 understands how much they depend on the open ecosystem that they've grown up in. And that's really a wonderful sign for the future. And of course, so this is, I'm running long, so I'm going to skip over this, but basically we'll put up the slides, some great quotes from Eric Schmidt about why mobile is critical. And of course, the open source community is there. OpenMoko, an open source hardware platform based on Linux for mobile, amazing. We've got Android, so there's real action happening in the open phone space, and I hope that you guys are looking at it, thinking about it, and you're going to make a contribution in that area. And I'm going to finish. I don't have time to recite the entire poem. At my talk at ETAC, I recited one of my favorite poems by Rainer Maria Rilke, and I'm going to tell you the story. It's about Jacob wrestling with the angel, and it's a story from the Bible. And the wonderful line is from the poem is, what we fight with is so small, and when we win, it makes us small. What we want is to be defeated decisively, like Jacob was, by successively greater things. And I feel like as we look at our success in the last 10 years, we can be really proud, we can be really excited at all we've accomplished. But what I'm most excited about and most encouraged by in looking at this group and looking at the work of open source is that you're tackling new, hard problems. That you're not just resting on your laurels and saying, wow, yeah, we're going to go and we're going to be just like everybody else with software in the enterprise. No, we're going to find what's new, what's hard. We're going to be defeated by that angel sometimes. But we're going to come away strengthened from the fight. Again, another line from Rilke. So work on what's hard, work on what's important, and make freedom ring in each new market that emerges so that history is not a wave that passes us by, but one that carries us to the new future. Thank you.